elements that we're learning this week. And I don't know why it says 3 because it's actually week 4. Texture is basically the physical surface of an object, or the appearance of the physical surface of an object. It appeals to our sense of touch. The word for that is tactile. Of course, I'm going to say that again later today. But when we look at this bird, it adds to our connection, because when we're looking at this bird, because we're so close to it, we can see the softness of the feathers and sort of the pattern. We can imagine, now of course we wouldn't be able to touch that bird in real life, but we can imagine, and our body has a sensation of what that would feel like. So it allows a better connection to our subject. And again, I'll talk about this when we talk about texture, but all texture in photography is implied. And then uniform texture is a repetition of texture. So I'm giving you a little sneak peek of our texture vocab. Pattern, on the other hand, so pattern and texture go hand in hand. Sometimes texture becomes a pattern, but not always. So pattern is the repetition of any series of elements. So the repetition, so right here what's repeated is the shape, the organic shape of the water bottles, the color of the, of the labels, and I guess sort of the implied line. But pattern is the repetition of elements to create a series. And it helps to unify your image. But sometimes it can be boring, so breaking it up is going to help us create variety. Now, we can access, so when you're taking your picture this week, you can do things in an obvious way, or you can do them in a little bit of a more subtle way. So I'm going to show you examples of obvious and subtle versions of both. So here is a pattern that is very obvious. The repetition of the, of the log shape, of the shape and the colors throughout the image. This picture is taken by one of my really good friends, Gabe, and I love this picture because it's a little bit more subtle. So we do have pattern here. We have the pattern of the white bricks, we have the pattern in the little planter, and the pattern in the vertical lines of the wall in the background, but it's more subtle. It helps to tie the picture together, but it's not like hitting you over the face with it, or over the head. Texture, we can also be obvious. This is an obvious one, so texture, I meant to say this in the beginning, but texture, we really only see texture if we're really close to our subject. So you're not going to take a picture of like a forest from afar and say that it has texture, because you can't really get the sense of the feeling of something unless you're close to it. So this is more obvious. We can get the texture of the sand. It looks almost even like sandpaper. And that's a uniform texture, which means it's repeated. But it's also broken up. I didn't want it to be too boring, so it's broken up with the smoothness of the rock, plus the cute little heart rock, and then the spikiness of the seaweed. And I took these pictures, which is why they aren't credited. And this texture is also, this is an example of texture that's a little bit more subtle. So we do still see sand, but the sand is further away, it's blurry, so we don't really get the texture of that. Whereas the tangled ropes, we definitely get that feeling we could like touch the tangled ropes. And we aren't close enough to necessarily tell the texture of each rope itself, but we get that tactile sort of sense of touch when we look at the picture. So there are two, there's an example of an obvious and a less obvious pattern or texture, pattern and texture.